You're
So
recording.
hello, Calum. Hello, Daniel.
Hello.
Thanks for meeting with me today.
Hello,
Really
Dana.
looking forward to
Hello.
our conversation. Really excited to have the piece here at Lawmeyer Sculpture Park in St. Louis. And yeah, this has been quite the project, I think, between all three of us. Really, it's been an ongoing
Yeah.
conversation, and it's finally come to be, and it really looks great. It's a beautiful piece. Um, so, Callum, I'll start with you. Can you
Mhm.
provide some context for how you and Daniel came to work together on the project Players? Um, can you just give us a little background about how you sort of came to connect with Daniel?
Yeah, well, I think, as you know, I wanted to reconfigure the original plan, but still use the premise of the show and also involve the trees and kind of keep the simplicity of an artwork, which is to do with sound. So, I began to research initially ways of eliciting sound, music from trees, but then that disappeared and it started to become something else. And through the research, I came across Daniel's work, and I thought this is really interesting because it appears very simple, but actually there's quite a complexity to it, or its minimalism. Is actually that's where its beauty lies. The fact is you're just getting sound directly from solar panels. And I thought, well, this could work in terms of relating to trees and the forest by placing an object like that in against the trees and use the canopy as some way to modulate the sound as well as the patterns of the sun. And so I just made contact with Daniel, began a conversation about it, and then after a while we agreed to work together on it. And yeah.
Great. Okay. Um, I'm going to address this question to both of you. Can you provide some input into how the work developed? Because of you, each of you sort of had separate, but in some way similar interest in, I guess, what I call the environment of sound. Can you provide some insight into your collaborative process and, maybe, I don't know, give us some I guess idea about how you ended up working together, how the project sort of came to be, I guess.
Yeah, do you want to go first?
What was our working method is an interesting thing to think about. So yeah, well, the question is, how did we work, right? How did we work together?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, do you want to talk a little more first about that, about what the work is? Maybe we could talk a little bit about what the structure is. I mean, you're going to hear the work when you go to the park, that it's kind of like the experience is about the viewer walking through it and kind of contouring the sounds by experiencing them throughout the place. But that was interesting because that last part of it was very, very far away from our collaboration, which was very much about separate activities of designing these electronic circuits that are meant for solar activated contours. And then the work that Calum was doing, which was designing these enclosures that reference the sounds of these boxes and show people how to listen, essentially. So the final experience is something that really we couldn't have imagined until actually setting the work in the park itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we hadn't worked together or even contacted each other before. I contacted you. So that initial, the decisions about how you're going to work together, can you work together, and how's that going to, what we're both going to learn from that experience, that kind of thing. Where can we push stuff? What do we have to compromise on, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess it did, because Daniel knows so much more about electronics than I do, it was good for you to bring that input and the circuit boards and your kind of knowledge from that. And obviously I work with, and so does Daniel, but I particularly at the moment work with a lot of CNC technology. So I thought that could be useful for building the enclosures and for me to push the boundaries there a bit. And and then there's the context of where this was going to go, where this artwork was going to go in the park. You know, what context was that? Was it ground-based? How dense the foliage was going to be? Could the public get close to work? How was that going to work? You know, and to work out this kind of auditory map, you know, it's like the contouring of the sound, as you're saying, Daniel. You know, all these things have got to be worked through, and kind of lots of little micro decisions, you know, kind of worked out. And some of them you just have to go with the flow with as well. You know, there's obviously a pandemic going on, and the decisions change, and that's fine. And being flexible is incredibly important as being an artist, you know, being a good artist. So, yeah.
Well, another question is, you know, who are the authors of this piece? So the first moment, it looks like, you know, that Calum and I, you know, that Daniel Fishkin and Calum Stirling are the authors of this piece. But then you go a little bit further, and you don't really know who the authors of this piece are. And I want to say a few words about what that might be. So this piece is, you know, an 18-channel sound installation, essentially. That means there's, you know, sound coming from 18 sources that happens far up above the audience's head in trees. And it's controlled by the sunlight, meaning that as the sun passes throughout the day, different solar powered synthesizers come online or go offline as the sun trickles in through the leaves of the trees. So maybe the sun is the, you know, the master of this piece. But then there's another way of thinking about it, which is that when you hear the piece, you hear the wonderful bird song of St. Louis. You hear all of these animals talking along with the synthesizers, especially on a nice cloudy day when they're a little bit quieter. And then I would be remiss to not mention that, you know, the work of designing circuits is a collective activity. You know, I'm doing this work with solar powered synthesizers that's connected to many other artists since the 60s who have been doing work with solar panels. That is, it's a very collective activity, you know, and makes you wonder, you know, that there are things outside you that are influencing you all the time. And I think this collaboration provided me an excellent opportunity to reflect on that, you know, how involved in existing systems our work is.
Yeah, I think that's
great.
I'm just going to say, I think that's really interesting. The fact is, some of the technology and the technique and the kind of craft things need to be done in a group, whereas I work alone most of the time, but I can see that collaboration is definitely a very strong way forward, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I've learned a lot from this as well. And,
yeah.
And also this transatlantic, you know, the idea of not taking big heavy artworks backwards and forwards across the Atlantic, you know, trying to save on energy, be more, you know, kind of ecological. Definitely. That's,
yes, it was very interesting to get our loudspeakers for this installation donated by Dayton Audio in Ohio. And then we realized we would save a lot of gasoline because they would, you know, we wouldn't be paying for the shipment of these speakers twice back and forth over the Atlantic. Well, I also work alone very much of the time, but this is a nice opportunity to reflect on when you're alone, you're never really alone, because the ideas you have are coming from other sources. So it was interesting too. And the way that you and I worked on this, Calum, was that we very much did, you know, separate the sound from the visual, which for me was interesting because I'm usually working quite intensely on wood, and the physical craft of my personal work is very important. So giving up a little bit of that control is really interesting because it allowed me to go deeper into the sound.
Yeah, and I want to mention the fact that the project sort of developed while you know, or before either of you even had a chance to do a site visit to Longmire. Yeah. So neither of you had been here before. So I think, you know, the collaboration, I guess, even pushes further into my curatorial work, which is, you know, where my realm sort of oversteps sometimes in, you know, in working with artists where, decisions are made to place a work, to find the right site for a piece. And I think with this particular situation, where I was having to try and represent the environment outside in some way to give you a sense of the landscape and where it might be a good place for, for the installation. And I think, ultimately it was put in a perfect, area,
it looks,
park on this trail where there aren't any other artworks. So I like that it's concentrated in a space that is just trees, essentially. Okay, well, I will move on to my next question.
Wait, before you mention
sorry,
that,
go ahead.
that next question. So that was also a very interesting development in the work that that I think is related to your curation, which is that these players were originally conceived to be something that you could pick up and move around, and they were designed that way, but the decision to put them far up in the trees really does something interesting to the piece. And I've been thinking about that. In a way, there's like the human touch, right, would distract you from hearing nature. Because if you really put them far up and remote, it's much more about the sun and the birds than about your touch. So it's a really interesting thing that happened. That was actually quite alarming to me. I remember to have that discussion, because I spent so much time just like holding a solar panel and listening to this, moving the solar. This is like a lot of music, just doing that.
Right.
But so it was totally alarming, but then putting them up in the trees gave me a chance to really listen to the shadows of the leaves. That was so interesting.
Yeah, I have to say, what I think also happens when we eliminate that interaction with people, that like tangible interaction, is it relinquishes that control that we have over that object. And I think that's some of what's happening in many of the works in the exhibition as well. Just sort of this need for us to control and manipulate these spaces. And in this particular instance, we're sort of giving that up. And allowing it to, I guess, just sort of live in that space. Yeah. Okay, so I guess, again, we'll build on that conversation about the technologies, just so we can give our visitors and our visitors listening to this video, watching this video, what are the technologies and the materials that are being used in the sounders? How do they work? I'll just leave it there, and then I'll continue on to my next part of that question.
Yeah, well, probably Daniel should answer that, because
but possibly you should also talk about the technologies of the CNC, because that's a technology of the solar sounder. So let's leave that in for sure.
Well, maybe we'll start with the sound, and when we can go to the sort of
basically, a solar sounder is a solar powered synthesizer, and most synthesizers usually have knobs and dials and let's say this, I'll start over. A solar synthesizer essentially is played by sunlight. You usually have a synthesizer where you're adjusting knobs and putting personality into it by how you play it. And this is usually a circuit that has a stable battery, essentially a 9-volt battery or a wall plug that goes to a stable voltage source. And the idea is that the voltage source is stable, and then the human is moving the controls. But the whole concept that we've been working with in this installation is that make the circuit static and then allow the voltage to change. And you do that by taking the battery out of the circuit, using an unregulated solar panel to power a synthesizer circuit board. So this is one of the circuit boards that I've designed. This one is, I've used this in other installations. It's called Fluffernuts. And there's an amplifier here, and then there's 2 sine wave oscillators here and a ring of sawtooth oscillators. Now that might not make sense to someone who doesn't know what an oscillator is. An oscillator is a thing that makes sound. And the way I make sound with this is that I put components in to say, I want this to be a high pitch, I want this to be a low pitch, I want this to be a medium pitch, I want this to be a rhythm, I want this to go woo, 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 I want this to go da 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 da, I want this to go woo. And then I start mixing those sounds together with wires. And then I take that over to a solar panel, and then I listen to the different sounds of that. And it's a very kind of handmade heuristic. There's no way to predict what things are going to sound like until you put a solar panel on the end of the wires and put a speaker on the other end. And you have to make music with that, and then you tune the circuits together. So, what I brought to this installation is a larger practice of doing creative things with solar power, right? And you can basically say that that this is like, it's not about charging battery, it's not about renewable energy, because renewable energy is charging batteries and using that energy later. And this is a very wasteful type of solar, because it doesn't go anywhere, it just goes right into the speaker and makes music. And that's a nice way to reframe the whole concept of waste, right? That we get to, making, no one would ever say that, making music is wasteful, right? And no one would ever say that, a tree is wasteful as the leaves fall and, start to degrade into the ground. That no one calls nature wasteful, right? So, but yeah, there you go. That's kind of how the technology works. But to give an idea, as what I was doing as we worked on it, is I was trying out new circuit boards, new arrangements of transistor oscillators, new arrangements of sound topologies, and trying to imitate different things that are found in nature. So I made, for this installation, I also developed a bird synthesizer that was the first time I got to explore.
Cool.
Yeah, there you go.
Wow, thank you.
And what I liked when I came across your work, Daniel, was the simplicity of not necessarily the palette of sounds, but how direct it was between the solar panel and the speaker.
Right.
I could tell that you were doing some pretty nifty tricks with quite simple components, which took a long time to research and try to work out how to get them to make just the right amount of mistakes, as it were. Have that sort of balance going on. And this is what the original performance with the trees, when the idea of using galvanic skin response meters, is that potentially just do something very simple. And I was trying to find a different equivalent for that, which we got, which was great, Well,
we really got the trees back into it in the end, which was really kind of the magic of bringing everything on site. And but maybe you could talk a little bit about what these enclosures are for players, because I really think as I was putting circuits into these boxes, I was making some decisions about where to put speakers and what sounds to put into them.
Yeah.
And they ended up being all different, completely heterogeneous.
Well, indeed. I mean, that was partly accident, partly because of the design issues. But there was a core idea, which was to try and use this digital fabrication manufacturing process called CNC to make them as a single unit, even by pre-gluing up a sort of a box and then machining the thing in the round. So you ended up with a kind of more organic shape. And certainly initial tests were like that. And then we talked about the wall thicknesses and trying to get the wall thickness down, but to be a bit thinner so there was better harmonics. Would that be correct? Or to get different, and then I guess I was machining box sizes according to postage and the cost of sending these things, and also an awareness of, an ecologically based show. but I'm still sending things across the Atlantic on a plane. So it's like how to reduce the size of the volume to get things out quickly. So we had a scale according to what size of speakers we had and the size of the solar panels. And then I was making boxes which were kind of according to the kind of the costs and the sizes of the speakers and things, and wall thicknesses, and some of the shapes were determined by natural objects, and some of them were geometric, and using a mixture of hardwoods, sometimes for their resonant properties and sometimes just because I had them in the workshop.
You used
And
a lot of
sometimes,
eucalyptus.
sometimes not, because it was just random and the thing worked, so it was like that.
Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about wood? You used a lot of eucalyptus for this installation.
I did, yeah, which is Uruguayan. It's a forested wood, so it's recycled. It's kind of what's the word? What's the word? Yeah, but it's a fast growing tree. I know it's newly available in the UK, but I know it grows naturally in America. Red Grandis, and that was kind of nice. It's a nice color wood. It's used in machine, which is really good. I used a little bit of birch. I used some oak. I used white maple, American white maple, which had come from America to Scotland. Then I machined it, sent it back again in a different format, There was walnuts. That was a wee bit of walnut going on. That's American walnut. So these are materials I have in the studio for other projects, and some of them were brought in for this project and then just sort of blended together in the format that worked. I think the reason for the different shapes is because I'm basically trying out different ideas, and so each one, as I went along, I was making new design decisions, or perhaps realizing that I had to get a set off to you, Daniel, within 5 days, which meant I only had 2 days to make them because of other work, etc. And they had to just, things had to get made that way. So, they have to be designed, I guess, according to orientations as well. You can put them in, and there's a whole. So there is really quite a lot of design going on, isn't there? There is really a lot of design because it's like a product, really, essentially. It's kind of like
I think this question of where to put the speaker and where to put the solar panel, and then where does the box live? It's the entire world of sound. Some of the boxes that you made said to me, this one should make sound in the morning. But that was not a poetic thought. That was just about quite literally, the way I have to put this means that where the speaker is going to be oriented, where the sound is going to point is going to be in relation with how the sun hits the panel. Whereas others, the panel could be vertical and the sound could be coming out from the bottom of it, which means it could be more of an all-day type of sound. So it's interesting. It's so hard to convey that and to explain that, but there is no right solution at all. I mean, you have to try different things, and that was some part of the installation are an earlier piece of mine, which are redwood and pine triangular boxes, and they're definitely kind of punky and handmade, and explore an earlier generation of the solar sound, and those sound totally different and look different and were installed differently too. So it's the orientation of all of this stuff very much affects the audience experience.
In terms of in terms of the idea of the craft of making things, I mean, your circuit boards are very beautiful objects in their own right, and it's kind of a shame that they're sort of buried inside because they do so much for the work. Well, but you've got that's a pretty simple one, and then yours are they're much more organic, aren't they?
They look simple, but actually that's because I use this process of surface mount, which is like using a robot in China to put micro components down, which is very, very different from the process of putting components in a circuit by hand. These boards, some of the prototype boards look really like wonderful little little mini sculptures with little cities living on them.
Sure. Yeah.
But actually, so what about this obfuscation? So it isn't, it's kind of a shame, but it's also interesting too how the installation ended up like these creatures ended up almost disappearing into the leaves, far above everyone's head. And I think that's kind of interesting too, because then it becomes very much about the audience experience of wondering how the sound is happening. So I think many layers of hiding, of many layers of obfuscating sound,
Yeah.
is actually a very important aspect of it. So it's like we all of that work goes into the circuit, but you don't see it. All of this work goes into this creation of a wooden enclosure and careful thought about where to put the panels and the speakers, but you don't see it because it's actually about the experience of carving your own symphony as you walk through the park.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually the perfect point to, I guess, go to my next set of questions, because I think what Daniel just said there relates, Calum, to the piece that you did that's in the show, the sound piece with the trees. So again, it's this thing we can't see, and you're making it audible. This, I guess, life experience of the tree, something that we wouldn't think about, again, that we can't see, but you've managed to make it something experiential for the viewer. And I think, what Daniel just said is kind of the perfect segue to my next set of questions. So as we were saying, nature activates this work on so many levels. The pieces encountered are read as sculptural objects nestled in the trees. And I think you both use this word autonomous instruments, which I really like. So the natural world is the setting, it's the backdrop, and the landscape is the collaborator. We were speaking about that earlier, I guess, activating its components. I think one of the things that I noticed right away when we were installing these, Daniel, is that we were hearing this sound. And while I could hear the sounds of players, I also started to notice all of the other sounds in the park that would have, again, been background noise, something that I just know is there and I just accept it. But at that moment that we were standing out there, I heard the lawnmower, and all of a sudden the lawnmower I found really irritating because I was trying to hear this other thing.
Yeah.
And so it made me really hyper aware of the other sounds. There was we had an event here quite a few years ago called Camp Out, and we had the opportunity to actually spend the night in the park. So people came, brought their tents, and one of the things I noticed was, I work here during the day. I don't really think about this place at night, and you just assume it's this quiet, I don't know, mysterious place. But, spending the night here, all I could hear were the cars from the highway. So what it did was because it's a park, you're automatically thinking there's nature just like embedded in this space, and there's no, I guess, human life. But it was one of the experiences I had while spending the night here. Like, while I wanted something that was very quiet, all I could hear were cars. So again, I think this installation did something, like even the first few moments that the sounders were out there being placed in the trees. So as an outdoor sculptural installation, it is ephemeral, it's temporal. What would you like visitors to walk away with as a result of their experience while walking the trail?
I'm not sure they're going to know what it is till they've left it. So they've come into the experience, they've walked through it, they've walked around it, but as they leave, they're going to have that experience you're talking about what happened to that sound, what relationships did I just make, in that time, which I wasn't which are subconscious, essentially, I think, you know. I hope that people spend the time just to walk, to have the time just to spend walking between, you know, the different instruments, and kind of like make tonal sequence, almost, you know, have a route, create a sequence of their own, and listen to the natural environment, or that relationship between the two things, you know, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, that thing you're describing, you know, the incredible composer John Cage said something around those lines in 1933, which was that he remarked that people would hear his music and be confused by it at first, but upon leaving, they would start to hear the sounds of their environment differently, and that maybe the sounds of cars and motors in the city would go from being disturbing to being interesting for them. And he called that, he said that his music, therefore, I guess he said this kind of jokingly, but had a therapeutic value for city dwellers. Yeah. So that's an interesting question, whether, you know, what the park is, you know, what Laumeier Park is in St. Louis, next to the city, you know, the big city, and what the meaning of nature is. You know, the park itself is a reference point, is a respite from the city, but you can't quite leave the city because you always hear the cars at night.
Yeah.
So, so hopefully it changes that orientation, because we can't just expect that nature is this untouched, remote thing, because then that denies the fact that we are nature.
I was going to say, particularly during the pandemic, I mean, people have gotten a lot closer to nature, and especially people in the city who don't maybe have access to, you know, parks and a garden of their own or whatever. It's just particularly in Glasgow, because we live in tenements, that local parks and kind of, you know, kind of little lochs and stuff have become incredibly important, inner city green spaces. And a lot of people have taken up bird watching, kind of, you know, kind of tree hugging, all that, whatever it is that they're into. And it's quite amazing the amount of people have really begun to get into inner city nature, you know, like studying foxes, urban foxes, all this kind of stuff, you know.
Right.
So somehow our work fits into that conversation about our relationship to city living, to green spaces, to how humans are going to work with these spaces in both positive and negative ways. Because I think it's been a conversation that I've not maybe had with you directly, Daniel, but it's to do with how these pieces work with the birds, isn't it? Yeah. And it'd be interesting to get an ornithologist or a kind of bird expert to work out if the birds are working harder, to work with the sound, against the sound, all that kind of stuff.
Listen to them.
Yeah, they sound amazing.
Just listen to the birds. I mean, we could get an ornithologist, but we could just go to the installation and listen to them sing. I mean, that's the info. Yeah. But you know, this question of nature and the Zoom times, like, I mean, we're on computers right now, right? Yeah. So it's like, we have to, it's so cool to be able to leave our home offices and go into nature and really get to know it and experience it and go hiking. But it's also important that we don't make a hard cut between the digital life and the nature life. We have to start thinking about, this is just my own crazy freaked out philosophy, but we have to start thinking about this as nature too, because that means we start to think about technology differently. So that's I guess the whole concept of the whole solar sounder approach is, what if we make technology differently? What if we do it differently? And that way, when we're doing technology, we're putting solar panels on things and going out into trees instead of going into a dark concert hall and blasting loud techno music. You know, let's make electronic music that's talking to the birds, that's in the birds, so that we see that we're making nature too, and they're making music too.
Great. Yeah. Well, I think that leads perfectly to my next question, because again, it connects to the conceptual, I guess, endeavor that you've both gone on with this piece. How do you think artists can play a role in helping us move as a society into a new phase beyond the Anthropocene, using these types of new media innovations that are playful, but that are also using the available technology that we have right now. How do you think that your work as a conceptual artistic endeavor, or you can speak to just being an artist, can help us move beyond that?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this quite a lot. I think we all have, actually. And I feel much closer to science than I do to art per se. Or I'd be more interested in collaborating with scientists.
I think the answer is Medicare for all. No, I mean, I'm serious. I think that there's not, let's just not put too much of the burden on art to change the world. Like, let's, it's great to do work in nature and everything, but like, let's not make art a panacea for social change.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, it sounds like this project has been a good one for both of you, as we've been discussing. And as a curator, I'm happy to hear this, of course. I like how this developed, honestly. It's been pretty cool. How might this collaboration inform the next phase of your practices?
Great question.
Good, yeah, good question. I guess just take stock and have an open discussion about what we actually did here, I obviously haven't seen it, so I'm slightly remote from the process, and I'm kind of dying to get some of them over here and try them out. And but this is quite a new way for me to work, and I think it's just inevitably because we are so globally connected now. This is going to be much more popular as a way of working,
Yes.
And then just in the way I was talking earlier about working with scientists and kind of specialists, this seems to be the way forward, and bring it on. Yeah, it can be difficult because especially if you're an artist trained as an individual artist, an individual voice, to work collaboratively can be difficult. But I think once you get over yourself, essentially, then I think it's a really good way to do work. Yeah.
Yeah. Daniel.
So the question is how this is going to inform the next phase of, I mean, I think I've been working with this concept of solar synthesizers in my own work since 2017. And I guess very recently, there's a very interesting book coming out about, it's like a comprehensive history of solar powered art.
Wow.
It's coming out on Routledge like in a month. And
Okay.
I've read the early drafts on it, and I was stunned by how much I didn't know. And just there's so many artists who've been doing stuff with this that I'm totally ignorant of. And that was a really interesting moment to think about, like how the work can play into a larger history. The whole concept of like, when I remember when Calum sent his last pack of enclosures to me, they were black. They were this beautiful vinegary black. I say vinegary because when you put vinegar on wood, it turns kind of blackish. The tannic response of the wood and the vinegar. It was just this beautiful color, and I thought, I've never done that before. And when you're making instruments, when you're making sculptures, you have this ability to make something new that people haven't seen, or maybe they have seen but haven't seen configured in this way. And so I think this is kind of a thing to keep remembering, that as I'm working and making new circuits and making new sounds for a solar orchestra, that there's totally different ways of imagining these things, of thinking about them. I'd like to see some solar players that are like very, very big, like bigger than guitar amplifiers. And I'd like to see other people making them, and I'd like to see them sprouting up around all corners of the world. And I'd like to see I'd like to meet people who are also messing with these ideas, and hear what their sounds are like, and feel what the forms of their sculptures are like. And it's a really weird way to make music. And
it strikes me that them being physical objects and being able to view them in the round, live, seems important. That it's not a screen-based activity. That ultimately, that part of your practice or my practice, it does want to go and live out in the world, And I get a buzz if I remember that it's probably dawn in USA and that they're just coming alive. Do you know what I mean? That every morning I get excited by that idea that, you know, however remote it is physically or mentally, to me, that I really like that idea. And actually, I sometimes text people and just remind them that they just they've just woken up for the day, you know. So yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Great, cool. Well, thank you. Thanks to both of you for being involved in the exhibition here at Lawmeyer, and yeah, thanks for this great conversation.